Hello and welcome to Table for Five with no reservations. Take a seat at the table for a fresh, sweet, salty, tart, and pleasantly bitter conversation.
Thank you for joining us. Take a seat at the table. In this episode, we will be talking about autism, the signs we may have missed, and some of the things we saw early on. Seated tonight, I have Jen Dunn from Vancouver, British Columbia.
Hello.
Rachel Flanagan from St. Paul, Minnesota.
Hey, everyone.
Jamie Ramos from Denver, Colorado.
Hello.
Kim McIsaac from Boston, Massachusetts.
Hi.
And Tabitha Cabrera, me from Phoenix, Arizona. Hi, everybody. So tonight we wanted to start out talking about what threads we have as the five ladies here. All of our children are autistic, and the early signs that we potentially missed or weren't really something that we found on checklists when we were Googling on the internet, basically. So for me, I have two children on the spectrum. My son, Nixon, is 4.5, and my daughter, Nora, is 2 years old. With our son, we knew nothing about autism. We knew nothing about what we were looking for in regards to early signs, and he did not have the classic signs of autism that you find on a checklist. He lost language was the major indicator for us. Looking back, I think there were some other signs that we didn't really notice, like he used to love to stare at fans. He used to line up some of his toys. We always thought it was just organizing his toys. He loves to look at things from the surface, his eye up to the level of the toy. And I think, we were cautious at the beginning with getting him diagnosed, which now I realize was so stupid. But we were worried about him having a label. We were worried about them misdiagnosing him because he was so young. We were new to the autism world. And so we kind of didn't rush to get him diagnosed. We did get him on waiting lists. There's extensive waiting lists in Phoenix for diagnosis. And then our daughter, with her, we knew what we were doing. And so she completely lost all of her language around 18 months. No sounds, no words, no nothing. She developed typically. She sat, walked, crawled, talked on time. We didn't really have a worry about her until the dramatic change at 18 months. She quit answering to her name. She quit being engaged with us, had trouble sleeping. All of the things that you might find on a checklist, she did. She got diagnosed right before her second birthday. She definitely has more classic signs. Nixon now, he has more things that he did once he developed language. We could see more. He script, repeated things from television shows and different movies and us. He also runs back and forth, which is a stimming behavior for him, a repeated behavior for comfort, which we didn't realize at the beginning was a stim, but he loves to run back and forth, move his body, jump up and down, those kind of things. He also doesn't have really conversational language. He's working on it, but asking questions are hard for him. He just recently learned his own name, and he's learning our names. He knows his dad's name now, and he calls me Taba because that's what my husband calls me. So sometimes he'll call me Taba from the downstairs when I'm upstairs. So that was pretty much us. Our early signs with him were confusing. They were definitely confusing, and we had a lot of people telling us that we should get him evaluated, and we just didn't see what we were finding on the internet to match him specifically, and it was pretty hard wait. So it took us over a year to get him diagnosed. What about you, Kim?
So obviously it was a little different with her because it was almost 22 years ago. She had a lot of the classic signs that they weren't necessarily on the checklist at that time. Like going back now, I definitely see more signs, but she developed pretty typically up until about close to a year. Then she kind of stopped. She stalled. She stopped responding to her name. We thought she was deaf at first. She did a lot of had a lot of sensory things. She did start, her first 5 or 6 words that she said, and those kind of just stalled, and eventually they kind of just faded away. We were more focused at that time on her hearing because we thought that she was deaf. We brought her for 2 hearing tests. They were both inconclusive. They couldn't tell if she could hear or not. She also had chronic ear infections from 8 to 13 months. So we also thought she could have had some kind of damage from all the ear infections that she had. But as time went on and she still didn't develop words, we started becoming more concerned. And she had a lot of behaviors that I guess you would kind of call odd behaviors, but they weren't concerning. She would spin around in circles, or she would bang the cabinets, things like that. She didn't line up her toys like classic autism does. She used to do a half circle in front of her, and then eventually she made a full circle, so she would be in the middle and she'd make a circle around her. But all these things isolated weren't really concerning, but everything together was we kind of had to push for early intervention. The doctor wanted to wait till she was 2. She also, like, her sleep started getting off. Her eating became picky, but it's hard because she was also a 1.5. So they kind of march to the beat of their own drum, all 1.5. I run a daycare. You see all different kinds of, kids stepping on toys instead of playing with them and, all these other things. So we finally got the referral to early intervention. It was a 9-month wait to get her into Children's Hospital for an evaluation. Luckily, they had a cancellation and we got in earlier. We saw a whole team of specialists that saw her, and ultimately they diagnosed her with autism. It was autism, PDD/autism at the time because she was so young. In Boston, they don't really use the terms. They don't use numbers. It's just autism until they can kind of see where they end up. And eventually they took away the PDD diagnosis and she just had autism.
Kim, what is PDD?
Pervasive developmental disorder.
Yeah.
So basically, it's kind of faded away now. They used to use it almost like if you didn't meet enough of the criteria, not necessarily high functioning, you still had a lot of the developmental delays, but just, like the rigidity, the repetitive behaviors, like all those type of things, you didn't meet enough of the criteria to be labeled with autism. Obviously, the criteria has changed over the years.
Yeah, the DSM changed it from PDD, Asperger's, and autism.
I think there's 1 or 2 other ones too. Rett syndrome, I think, is one of them too.
Rett's is a genetic disorder that has similar characteristics, and they look at it generally when you have a regression, which I didn't know. Sometimes it's a different category, I think, than autism, but it's similar characteristics of autism. And so they changed it from autism, PDD, and Asperger's to level 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 is what Asperger's used to be. Level 2 is PDD, and level 3 is
so
autism.
They don't use the levels in Boston at all.
Oh, they still don't.
Nope, they still don't. I think that because they're more for insurance, like they're more for purposes of therapy. They're not really for purposes of medical. And I think that they don't want to put somebody in a certain category at the age of 18 months or 2.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, clearly she's severe. She's nonverbal. And
Phoenix is the opposite. So they always use the levels here, and it's for services purposes. And I think certain countries still use PDD and autism and Asperger's. So
she was young for the time, not necessarily for now, but she was young for the time. So I think that's why they basically it was like PDD/autism.
Yeah. And one thing that's fascinating about your story is that she was the first kiddo in Boston to receive what?
She was the first child in Massachusetts to receive funding through early intervention for ABA therapy, which I only found out like 3 years ago. Like I didn't know that at the time. So pretty crazy. So that's what they said. They just said do ABA, and they said okay, and till she can get into school. And that we just kind of started the journey with we were already getting therapies through early intervention, so she was already getting therapies prior to the diagnosis, so like that kind of didn't change, but we added the ABA until she could get into preschool, like a developmental preschool.
What about you, Jamie? How'd it go with your son?
My son's really similar to your son, Tabitha, to Nixon. He was hitting all the milestones, like the baby checklist milestones, up until about like at a year, there was a couple, and then 18 months, that's more when like the verbal milestones he wasn't hitting. And he did begin speaking, but it wasn't very much. He would say the dog's name. He would say like mom, dad, really basic things. I think milk, baba, things like that. But around 18 months, for a couple months, he was like silent. And I was concerned about that. But then some of those little things he would still say. And at that time, we had my nieces and nephews visiting. And I just thought, I was like, well, maybe it's because there's a lot of other kids around. And he was always kind of different around other people. So I was like, maybe it's just overwhelming for him. The lack of communication probably should have been my first sign. And at his 18-month appointment, I brought that up to the pediatrician. And she was like, well, that can just happen. He's hitting all these other milestones. And he was my first. So I just didn't know. I had been around a lot of other kids in my life, but I never paid attention to any of that stuff. I wasn't checking off milestone lists for the kids I babysat. At his 2-year appointment, that was the first time at a new doctor because we had switched insurance. So we had to switch pediatricians. And that doctor, I didn't realize filling out the milestone paperwork that it was like directly for autism. And we go in and he had failed or whatever you want to say. And that took over the whole appointment. And that appointment, there should have been a lot of signs to me. For one, I had to bring my husband. I couldn't handle my 2-year-old on my own. He was just like a really fussy child and not always at home, but around other people and out in different places. And then the whole time I wanted to talk about sleep issues we were having, which the doctor didn't say to me then. And I didn't really get to talk about because we had to do another autism test in the room. And so I didn't get to talk about like the sleep issues and stuff as much as I wanted to. We didn't talk about his health at all, really. And I was just mad about that. I was like, what is this doctor doing? She's trying to push autism on us. And even then he kind of tested like not on, but like borderline. So she's like, let's just get him evaluated. And so then we were sent through the school system, which I didn't realize at the time that we could have gone to like a developmental pediatrician or through Children's Hospital, which is really our only developmental pediatrician in the area would be through Children's Hospital, which is like an insane wait. So we go home, we're on some wait list. We eventually get a call for a referral months later. His birthday's at the end of January. I think in April, we ended up getting like it wasn't even really an evaluation. It was just kind of like we met with pathologist, a speech pathologist, and like a special education lady. And they just kind of observed him and they thought he was okay. He was behind in speech. And so they said to watch that. And they said, give us a call if you're worried again as he approaches 3. I'm not going to lie. In my head, I was like, okay, great. It's not autism because honestly, I just didn't know how to deal with that. I wasn't even concerned about that. So it being thrown at me was like, then around 3, he still wasn't talking much. So I called them back specifically just for speech. There was no conversation. He would say kind of some stuff. He would repeat a couple things, but that was it. And so we go back and then at the speech consultation, he wouldn't even like sit or participate. So it became, okay, well, let's meet up for an evaluation. And so we went through that with the school district and really not until he was 3.5 or so did we get like an evaluation through them. And they even decided that once again, they thought he was borderline. He tested like 1 point onto their system and they did do an ADOS with him, which is a test for autism. But they decided as a whole, they didn't think it was autism. They thought it was a developmental delay. And they just had him do early intervention at a developmental preschool early. Eventually, I had a special education teacher come up to me. She's like, it's autism. Like I mentioned all this back and forth. She goes, oh, it's autism. I was like, oh, okay. Which still kind of crushed me. But someone needed to say that to me because people kept not saying that to me. So outside of that, he had great gross motor skills. His fine motor skills were always hard. He did the same thing as Nixon. He ran back and forth. He lined up cars. He would spin wheels on like his big cars instead of riding them and just watch them. He loved fans as a baby. He was quiet. He wasn't very interactive with other people. You had to be really in his face, like tickling him. He hated new places. And he had just always been awkward with different people. Some people he'd warm up to. You know, people try to play peekaboo with babies and stuff. If it wasn't one of us, he wasn't participating. There wasn't any flapping or spinning or the typical things that I thought autism was. He was cuddly, all that stuff. Like, so it was,
Yeah.
I just didn't
My
know.
son too. My son's a big cuddle bug. Both my kids are. Yeah. That's one of the things that you think aren't familiar with autism is that your children with autism don't like to be hugged or touched which isn't necessarily true for sure.
Well, it's like one of the first pamphlets we've got for an ABA clinic that they were referring us to, which I never called because of the pamphlet, was this kid like strangely in the corner, like, you know, looking, and it was like don't touch me kind of thing. I'm like, well, that's not my kid. And the stereotype of autism actually made me uncomfortable about it. So yeah, it was just not the things I expected. And now we're at a place where he has very recently become conversational. It's on his terms and things he likes, but he's very similar to Nixon. He didn't really know his name. He would refer to himself in the third person. He still pretty much does that. He doesn't say I or me. He's just learning our names because he's practicing at therapy for emergency purposes. So communication should have been my biggest thing, but most people were like, oh, he's a boy, it will come later. I believed it because I was in denial and I didn't want the label at first either. I didn't really understand I was like, if he gets that label, it's for life. And, I just needed to realize, well, he's autistic and that's for life. That's who he is.
What about you, Rachel, and your little sweetie girl?
So Celia is currently 6. She was diagnosed just around her 4th birthday. And when we went to her 4-year well check, I had this whole list of things to talk about with the doctor. And we went through everything. And by the end of a very long appointment, Celia had been like in the stirrups on the table and had been under every chair and opened every drawer and had used 13 tongue depressors. And she was looking for a grape flavored one, which was a prior doctor. She just had been into everything. She took the cover and the back off the book. And I mean, it was just like mayhem. And at the very end of my list, the doctor said, okay, well, I have a few things I'd like to go over. We need to talk about how Celie is severely neuroatypical. And I just laughed because we were cool. Like, I mean, my kid had looked up her dress. Like, we were far past traditional bedside manner. And anyhow, I asked what in the Sam hell that meant and learned that means ADHD is there, autism is there. There's many things. And eventually that led us to a evaluation, and Celie's adopted. And I had known that her siblings struggled with ADHD or autism, and a host of sort of other diagnoses. So I had mentioned that in the phone call to get scheduled. And anyways, we did the evaluation. We answered all the questions. Billy and I argued through what she could and couldn't do because I was taking these tests very literally. Like, in the last 6 months, does she? Has she? Will she? Can she? And one of the complicated parts of Celie is that she can and does accomplish certain tasks early in the day. And as she burns out, like has a meltdown and doesn't come back from them completely, she isn't capable of doing that same task. And so I was answering like, no, or sometimes, or whatever. And Billy was answering like, yes, she can. Yes, she can. Everything. Anyways, we learned that this whole darling bucket of quirks and energy, all of those little idiosyncrasies, like Kim said, maybe isolated, are not the end of the world. They're that big of a deal. You just like adjust your sails. But when considered together, autism. So Celie was diagnosed at first with autism and ADHD. Later, we discovered we are helping with depression and anxiety. And now we are changing the diagnosis from ADHD to fetal alcohol syndrome, which a lot of times there's some carryover there too. But it is such a thing to have a girl with autism where, like, again, I just thought she was this quirky kid. And maybe that's what I'd asked the universe for. And man, I was tired. It was getting harder. The systems were failing. We actually thought when she had her language regression, that it was because we taught her sign language. She preferred it. I just didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny with that too. Cause like, I think even if Nora would have been our only child and first child, I still would not have known what I was watching happen before my eyes, like she completely stopped development. And then on top of that, lost development, which is mind-blowing to watch happen over a period of time. And for me, I think I was in denial about what was happening with her because I wasn't ready to face the fact that I might have 2 children who had diagnosis. And I don't think I was doing it intentionally. And I love my children just the way they are. But I think I was blatantly oblivious to what was happening for a period of time because I was still processing my son's diagnosis. My son was diagnosed in January of 2020. My daughter was diagnosed in December of 2020. But looking back, when you look at it and you're like, what the hell was what was happening? Was I there?
Tabs, so like think about what someone is capable of in a neurotypical way at 9 months. So then when it is or isn't there at 12, and then when it isn't there at 18, and then isn't at 24. Like, listen, there are plenty of people like Jamie's story or everybody else's, frankly, that like the people sort of talk you out of these components. And I just wish that I would have trusted my instinct in a different way, because during the diagnosis, the very sure of it people that were doing her assessment called the school or the daycare that she was at. And the teachers were like, we know what autism is.
You're like, thanks.
She's like, okay. So they're like, no, I really don't think so. She's very talkative. Well, she scripts everything. And we've watched life skills videos so that she knows what she's doing. She can't nap, and you've got her bleaching toys, and you don't think that that's a thing? Come on.
Yeah. Oh, Jen, what about you? What was your experience with Kaya?
So I knew early on, I think from the get-go, I just had a feeling. I don't know why. I think because there wasn't a lot of movement during my pregnancy. Yeah. So she was developing typically. My daughter is turning 11 on April 6th, and she was diagnosed just before her 3rd birthday. And her dad knew at 6 months. He said, no, you should get the baby checked. There's something going on with her. He was visiting, and he walked around her. She was sitting on the ground watching Elmo, and he walked in a circle around her, and he called her from every angle and he said, she's not responding to her name. And I just ignored him, and I got mad. And every time he'd leave for a visit, he said, you should take the baby to the doctor. And so he knew he has 4 other typical children. And she didn't know her name at 6 months. She didn't know her name at 9 months. She didn't respond to anything, but she walked by a year, and she never really slept very well, but she was a baby and do baby sleep. And then when she started school, we did some early start stuff, and none of the early start workers thought she was autistic because she was social and she was a girl. And so she did stim though. She did a lot of arm flapping now when I look back on it, and a lot of mouth open, flapping. That's tons of pictures and videos I have. I'm like, oh, that's what that is. That's what that is. But there was one lady that came over. She was from the developmental department, and she was the first person that mentioned the word autism to me. And I remember Kaya and I were both sitting on the kitchen table. They were having her do these drop-in things. And she looked up and she said it to me. And she said, but this doesn't mean her life is over. She may still get married, and she may still do this. And her name was Christine. And I kindly escorted Christine out of my house and told her to never kindly come back to my house. And then I called her, the manager, the next day, and I went off. How dare this woman say my child has autism? She knew her for 30 minutes. And the lady was like, oh, okay, well, very gentle with me, very gentle. My daughter had autism, and Christine was right. And I phoned and apologized about 2 years later. And she said, it's okay. It happens all the time.
Oh, poor Christine.
I wasn't Christine's first time.
Christine. God love Christine. God love her.
Yeah. To you, Christine. And so now she's turning 11. And it was really apparent when she started school, because she was side by side with peers her own age. And that's when it got really hard to see the glaring differences between them. And Kaya didn't speak till she was 5. Nothing, not a word. She had no babble. There was no mama, no dada. There was nothing. Mama. So there's a mama now. But
I never realized how multifaceted autism was, in the sense of, like, when we think of our kids, I think of Kaya having sleep issues, same as Seely, but also having feeding issues, not the same as Seely. Like, I could go through these lists of all of our kids, and it's so interesting to hear the super concise story, but really it is all those things together. Babies do sleep sometimes. Kids do grow up to not use a nookie. Mine doesn't, but some do. And it's interesting to listen to.
Well, like Kim, they did all the hearing tests as well with her, which I think is always the first go-to they do. Yeah. Make sure they can hear, right?
And
so
we're 2 years in, and we have the hearing test scheduled next week at Mayo. 2 years into diagnosis.
Well, I joke that we got in before it became a booming business, because she was referred and then she was seen within a few months. the wait list here is well over 1.5 years. I mean, just like you, Tabitha, the wait list is a long time for people if they don't go private. And even if they go private, which obviously is out of pocket, it's still a 5 to 6 month wait list. So we got in before it boomed.
I have a similar story from what Jen said. Is the first lady who came out ever from early intervention was this cranky lady, not very not very pleasant, not very talkative. And she asked all these questions, and we knew that something obviously wasn't right. We knew there was some kind of delay and all that. And then she said something about autism, and I was like, what's this lady talking about? Because she's nothing like what I had ever heard about autism. And even my mom was like, no, like all we knew was like the little girl in the corner, nobody could touch her. And she's completely out of touch with reality, or Rain Man. Those are like the only two examples. And obviously there wasn't social media and all that stuff to see like, all the varying types. And plus I feel like it just wasn't as diagnosed at that time anyways. And all the other people that worked with her from early intervention were like, yeah, we don't really see that. Like she's so social, she's so happy, all these things, same like what Jen said. And so when we went to get her diagnosed, I was pretty confident that she didn't have autism. We knew she had sensory processing disorder, which really made sense for a lot of her symptoms, with not wanting to wear clothes and not wanting to be like, she could be touched, but like when she didn't want to be touched, you couldn't touch her. Like if she was upset, you couldn't touch her. If she was happy, she'd sit on your lap, you could hold her, you could hug her. But like if she was not happy and didn't want to be touched, you couldn't go near her. So she, a lot of those symptoms made sense with the sensory processing disorder. The autism didn't make sense from what we had known about autism, which is like the most severe autism that you could imagine. There wasn't all these varying degrees. So I was in for a little shock when they diagnosed her. Obviously Children's Hospital knew a lot better. They had more experience than these people did, but even her doctor didn't think so. So, it's just funny. But that one lady, she only came to the house that one time, and I'm like, clearly she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Get out of here, wrong. Christine.
Christine. Goodbye.
She's probably, I bet you her name was Mary, and I bet you she's Christine's aunt.
Mary.
Her mentor.
I think that's so interesting too, because there's always a person. I think, like for me, when we were at the very, very beginning of our process, I think I had just had Nora, and there was more talks around what was happening with Nixon at his Montessori program. There was more talks at early intervention, things were being thrown around, but no one was directly saying autism to us. And I asked, I said, do you think this is autism? And they'd be like, side glance, like no information for you. But I had this wonderful, lovely attorney who I worked with, who had a son on the spectrum who was similar to Nixon's, similar characteristics. She told me her story. In Phoenix, they will diagnose at risk. And so Nixon got an at-risk diagnosis in November. I always forget the exact timeline, somewhere between the end of October, beginning of November. And she talked me through her experience. She told me, so many nice things, like just said everything was going to be fine. Don't, stress about this situation. Here's how it went for us. Just lovely. And she recently passed away actually this year. Oh. But it was so gentle and sweet, and actually said to me, if it is autism, it's okay. And here's how it went for us. And here's how I felt too. Because I think, one of the things I wish I had known is that it's okay to have feelings about this experience. And as you're going through the process, you're going to feel a gamut of things, and yeah. I had already been through this once, and I was just as emotional, if not more, about my daughter's diagnosis than my son's. Mm-hmm. And it's still on the surface for sure. And, it's okay if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling, and I think there's a lot of things out there about, people in the autistic community who there's kind of a disconnect, I think, a little bit between parents and adults who are autistic, in this sense where we have feelings about our children's diagnosis and the therapies and their experience. But I can only see things through my lens. I can only know what I'm feeling, touching, seeing at a certain time. And for me, it was hard. And it's okay for anyone out there.
You just go through a grieving process, because you're going into a life that you didn't think you were going to be going into. You're being told all these things. And for me, like from what I read and knew of autism, there was just no way I could even wrap my head around that being my little girl.
Yeah.
And I think that, and even so, like, my daughter's never going to drive. My daughter's never going to get married. My daughter's never going to talk. Like at 24, I can pretty confidently say these things. She doesn't have the typical path that you think your children are going to have, where they go to high school and they have all these experiences. So it's okay to be sad about that.
Yeah.
I think too, it's that with that stuff, you don't even like, it's not like, you might hope your kid's going to be a doctor, but you don't think like when you have a baby, like, well, I hope they drive. I hope they graduate high school. I hope, those are things you don't even think about. And then they're ripped away from you. And you're like, oh, I just thought those would happen.
Yeah, you
and
don't
now
even think
they might not happen.
You don't even think there's a situation that's going to bring that not happening. And obviously there's other situations besides autism. So in those situations, all probably have a grief process too. I think that I didn't know that. You know what I mean? I read about it afterwards and I was like, well, this makes a lot of sense now. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And they can say, oh, you don't know what's going to happen, which is true. You don't know what's going to happen. Nobody has a roadmap. Nobody can look into the future. My daughter's done things that she was never supposed to do. So many things. So yeah, people can't say for sure, but when you find out, like, who knew that I didn't know that there were kids that didn't talk. Like, I didn't know that was a thing, and you're seeing this little girl who's full of energy and she's running around the house and she's sassy and she's funny. And, she's so lovable. And it's like, you're thinking about, all these things, and it's a lot. I feel like it really is. It's heartbreaking. You adjust to a new way of life. You adjust to, how your child's going to be. And, eventually you do accept it. And I love my daughter more than anything. She's a joy. She puts a smile on my face every day when I walk through the door, but it takes time to get there.
I would say I grieved the child that was in front of me. I grieved the child that I thought I would have.
Yes.
So that was very hard for me.
Yeah.
And it still is some days. It still is. Most days, actually.
I think a big part for me. So my son, when we actually went to get him medically diagnosed, because he had only been kind of diagnosed through school. Not even then was it like a confirmed thing, but to get services, you had to get medically diagnosed. And that's why we did that, which was right before 5. We ended up, once we got off wait lists and everything. When I got that diagnosis, I still bawled. I knew it was coming. I remember it was like 2 days after Christmas, and we had a Zoom meeting with the doctor. This was even pre-COVID. They told us everything. And when they said, I was kind of taken back by the severity. They told me level 3 and then a couple other things along with his diagnosis. And I just bawled, and I went to go see Little Women with my brother and sister afterwards. And I cried the entire time. I just bawled, and I was like, not crying about Little Women.
It's a sad movie, though.
But a big thing for me was like, I never knew. I didn't see it coming. Like, a lot of you felt something, or you really pushed for it. I felt awful because I either was in such denial, or I didn't, like, I don't think this now, but at the time I was like, I don't have that mothering instinct, I guess, because I had no clue. It blindsided me. I believed everyone when they were like, oh, he's just a boy, he's delayed. And I thought I failed as a mother right off the bat.
Yeah, I felt that exact way, Jamie. We were on the fence about getting him an early diagnosis because we had this idea that he would walk through his life with a diagnosis at a young age and we wouldn't be sure, which is just outrageous to think now. But I felt exactly the same way. I'm like, how did I not know? How did I not know that what we were looking at? And I felt the same way with my daughter. I really did. I felt like, what the hell? How did I miss this a second time? Are you kidding me? And
I remember just being so shocked because obviously autism wasn't as known about as it is now. But all these professionals are telling me that they don't think she has it. And of course you want to listen to them. And I didn't think she had it from what I known about autism. So when she got diagnosed, it was such a shock for me. And it probably shouldn't have been as much of a shock, but you're going to listen to what people say when they're telling you what you want to hear. Yeah, it's just, it was, and I thought she'd be fine by kindergarten. Because, people tell you, oh, you're going to do ABA and you're going to get this and you're going to get in her school and you're going to get in her speech. And she could still talk. She's still so young. I mean, she was diagnosed at 2.2, which is, pretty young then. Yeah, so in my mind, I was like, all right, she'll catch up by kindergarten and you'll be able to be with regular kids and a regular school and all that. And like, I really did think that for a short amount of time. I don't know. It's maybe my mind's way of protecting me. I don't know.
Or you could be me that talked the reception instead of booking the appointment because I didn't want to take her because I didn't want the diagnosis. So everyone, pediatricians, psychologists, everyone's pushing for this actual referral, which is through Sunny Hill. At the time, it was the only place that did the diagnosis. And I talked the receptionist out of it. I said, well, she takes me to what she wants. And I never wonder what she wants. And she said, okay. And she ended up not booking the appointment right then. It got booked again shortly after, but yeah, I talked her right out of booking it.
It's so interesting, all the roads that we go. Rachel, is there anything that you wish you knew?
I wish I knew, like I said earlier, to trust my instinct a little bit better. I wish that people didn't shy away from talking about it. I wish that if they're like she's going to hear this, but my very best friend is my cousin, and she has a master's degree in autism. And she was like, she's an energetic child. Oh my God, look at this. Terrible two started at 15 months. Oh, like you waited so long and look how much extra you got, like little things. And I wish that the school was like, I remember the second day I picked her up from daycare after we started Ritalin, and they said to me, she spoke to her classmates today. It's the first time she's talked to her classmates. And I was like, I'm Celie Flanagan's mom. Like I think you might have the wrong kid. She talks all the day. She talks all the day. She talks all the damn night. Like, what are you talking about? It hasn't talked to any peers. And it turned out she never spoke to another classmate. And you didn't tell me that. I ask you every day how it's going, how the day was, what you see, like how she's doing. So it's hard. Like I wish that there was a culture that change there. And I wish I had known to ask more questions and been more assertive. And I will also say, going through COVID-19, that prior to the pandemic, all the discussion was about early intervention with our children. And then there's like this halt. And I wish that I had built grace into my understanding of what early intervention is, what my goals were, whatever, because this has felt like a perpetual roadblock. And, I just wish I had a more calm approach to getting help fast, because it felt like we lost so much more without, having the paradigm shift, I guess.
Absolutely. I think there's so many feelings as a parent when you get a diagnosis. It's just so much that you go through, and it comes back in waves. Like sometimes you'll be fine, or you'll see a child as you're exiting a daycare the same age as yours, speaking in full sentences, and it'll just hit you. And most of the time my crying comes in the car when I'm driving home. For me personally, I can't keep it in once I get to the car, but it just hits you at different spots and different moments, and you almost can't control it. I wish that I had known that there were so many different facets of autism out there. And instead of going to Google, I wish I would have gone to other places where there were parents talking about it. I really do.
Yeah.
Because Google did not tell me D about this. Didn't tell me anything about this. But as I talked to more parents, I learned more about what autism really is, and not what Dr. Google tells you. So
Our favorite doctor.
Freaking Dr. Google. It's terrible. Don't do it. I do think it's so interesting too, with the different landscapes for people that are listening. Like, I have 2 children on the spectrum. Jamie has her firstborn, and then her daughter, who is neurotypical. Kim has her firstborn, who's neurotypical, then her daughter, who has autism, then 2 other kiddos who are neurotypical. And then we have Jen, who has 1 child on the spectrum, and Rachel, who has 1 child on the spectrum, both girls, which is uncommon in this world. So there's all different landscapes of how your child, what characteristics of autism they will have. As people always say, it's a spectrum, which is where that comes from. But also there are girls out there who are diagnosed with autism, even at an early age.
We really should say that if you're just learning about autism through us, certainly this is not a normal cross section of our community.
Yeah, for us here, there are 4 moms with girls on the spectrum, which is uncommon in our autism community.
Very.
It's getting more common for girls to get diagnosed, but it's not nearly as much as boys, because classic signs of autism on the checklist are usually associated with boys, not associated with the signs that we see in girls when they're diagnosed. So,
Although our girls have classic signs of autism.
yes, my daughter for sure has some class signs of autism and some not so classic signs of autism. So that's it. That's autism. That's our autism life. That's the signs we miss, what we wish we had known. There will be more autism coming your way because we can't help but talk about it here on this podcast. It's such a big part of our life. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us at the table for episode 4 of our series, Talk Like a Mother. Make sure to join us for episode 5, No Reservations. You'll either laugh or you'll cry. Do it with a table of 5. See you soon.